Morning. Thank you, Yasmina, and thank you to O'Reilly Media and the speakers for joining us here. As Yasmina explained, we're going to have Q&A. What I'd like to do, we've got an hour together, is have a discussion with the speakers. I have some questions for them, and then when we've got about 20 minutes left, we're going to turn it over to the questions that you have, so please go ahead and send those in. As Yasmina said, we have someone helping us keep an eye on the questions who will be sending them to me when it's time for Q&A. So the first thing that I'd like to do is start with the topic we have is a big one. You know, the evolution from private to public. Is there privacy in a digital age? And one of the challenges of discussing a topic like this is it seems like everyone has a different definition of what privacy means. So I'd like to start by asking each of the speakers, you know, what does privacy mean to you personally, and you know, how do you define it, and do you think that there can be privacy in the digital age? And I'd like to start by asking Dana, and if you could just try and give a brief response, maybe a couple sentences, just to set things, you know, set the tone here and let people know what your perspective is.
Sure. Thanks, Natalie. For me, privacy is actually not about controlling information, but rather privacy is the ability to have agency within a social situation and the ability to control that social situation. That's a really sort of messy and complex way of saying that what's at stake is people's ability to feel as though they're empowered and feel as though they have the ability to negotiate an environment in the way they want it to work out. And that sometimes involves data, but more often than not, it involves the ability to read the situation, to have a sense of what's going on, and to act accordingly. Okay, great.
And Heather, you're working with Google now. I first met you when you were working at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and would like to find out, how do you define privacy?
Absolutely. Thanks, Natalie. I think it's very funny that Dana says it's not about control, because everything that she said I absolutely agree with, but I actually do call it control. So I think that really highlights how much people think differently about the topic of privacy. I mean, for me personally, it is control of my information, but what that turns into is that ability to have agency in different contexts. And at Google, control is one of our privacy principles. We know that privacy means a lot of things to a lot of people, so we've tried to kind of break it down into transparency with our users about what we collect, control over how that data is used, and making sure that the information stays secure. And this stuff is hard. Like, defining privacy is hard, but we've tried to make sure that a lot of our products embody a lot of privacy-enhancing choices for users. It's
great.
Definitely a big topic.
Terrence, you recently co-authored a book that O'Reilly Media has published with Mary Ludloff on privacy and big data. How do you weigh in on the question, what does privacy mean to you? How do you define it?
Well, my take on privacy is really about control of the things that people know about you, going back all the way to sort of the Roman times, and control of your reputation. And I think the interesting bit about privacy is every society has a different view. In the U.S., we don't really have a clear definition of privacy, which is the reason that there's so much legislative debate about it. But I really think that privacy at the end of the day is all about being able to have control over how your personal information that you want people to not know about, what is your level of control of that? That's my definition of privacy.
Okay, great. And Jim, you're the Chief Privacy Officer and the GM of data systems at Intellius. What's your take, or Intellius' take on how you think about privacy?
Well, I think just sort of riffing off what Terrence talked to, I think that social media is just that, it's a medium. And with every media, whether it's from the earliest cave drawings to printing press to television and now the internet, we do mold each medium with values as much as it molds us. And I think that we have some of these values are intention. And for example, privacy embodies this value of discretion, and free expression embodies this value of disclosure. And I think critical to resolving this conflict is how we think about privacy and the right framing. And you've heard some of this, and I think it is, as Dana said, kind of messy. But is the right framing an ownership framing, one of a human right? Or is it really defining public and private spaces and the users and uses of data within those spaces? And I think we are in a debate to figure that out. And I have no doubt that we will resolve this debate. If thousands of years of history are any indication, we won't be throwing privacy under the bus here. We will resolve this, the conflict of these values.
Okay. Well, there's some themes, I think, in what everyone said. And, for the next question, I'd like to ask Dana. So you've talked about networked privacy, which is one of the topics we want to discuss here, which is the idea that it's no longer just what you share, it's what everyone who's connected to you is sharing. Do you think most people get that our data is connected and so is our privacy?
I think a lot of people understand that it's happening, but they don't know how to put their words around it. So an example to sort of make it more concrete is take what's happening in the world of DNA, right? If I make a decision that I want to use 23andMe and I want to get my entire genome and I want to share it, I haven't just made a decision to share my information. In many ways, I've made the decision to also share a lot about my mother, a lot about my brother, a lot about my grandparents, right? It may not be exact, but it starts to give this information. And DNA is sort of a classic and clean way of showing it, but it also plays out in terms of, for example, an email. Who owns that email? What's being shared, right? A lot of this content and a lot of what we care about is actually constantly about the relationships we have with other people and the interactions with other people. And that's actually why the control narrative becomes complicated, because more often than not, we think of control in terms of individual frames. And certainly we think of harm as an individual element. But in many ways, we have to move towards a more networked framework for thinking about this. And this is actually why, instead of focusing on control of information, I focus on control of social situation. Because a lot more of it is about being able to manage and negotiate people, not just things that are individually held.
Okay, so I think that's actually a good segue to talk about the book that Jeff Jarvis recently wrote. I know you all know him, and we talked about him joining us here at a schedule conflict, but he just published this book, Public Parts, How Sharing the Digital Age Improves the Way We Work and Live. And he talks about an emerging age of publicness, and that publicness and privacy aren't mutually exclusive. There's risk and benefits of both, but he makes a case for the benefits of publicness. And so, Jim, I'd like to ask you, what do you see as some of the benefits of publicness, or by that we really mean sharing?
Well, I think it's one of the cornerstones of our society. I think that we learn from each other. David Brooks had an op-ed today that talks to people over 70. Please share your life story and the lessons you've learned, so that young people can learn from the lessons that you learned throughout your life, and usually those lessons were hard-learned. And so I think there's tremendous value in connecting with people, and how we share is really the context for building those relationships. I think Jeff in his books talks about, Neanderthals had a larger brain case, and why couldn't they compete with Homo sapiens? Was it because Homo sapiens were more social, and we shared our failures together, and we learned as a society through social situations? So I think there's tremendous benefit to sharing and to being social. I think there's equally benefits to being private and understand those situations. For me, I define privacy as my body, my home, certain communication. Those are private contexts. Outside of that, I think there's great benefit to being public and hearing criticisms of your work and criticizing others and learning those lessons. I think there's tremendous value in that. That's how we move forward as a society.
Terrence, do you agree? Do you have a different perspective to add to what Jim's saying?
Well, I think I would agree that the sort of the multiplicative power of sharing has always been what has driven forward human society. One of the things that we talk a lot about in the book is that privacy is kind of a new concept. We evolved to be hunter-gatherers in tribes of probably about 125 people. And the whole concept of privacy is something that we've come to as we've become industrialized and urbanized. And it's always been something that until very recently only the wealthy could afford. And I think anytime we look at sort of the privacy debate, we really need to sort of do the balance thing, all right? There's the balance between privacy and security regarding law enforcement and prevention of terrorism. There is the balance between privacy and convenience I have probably 100 Facebook friends, and probably 50 of them I never would have seen again since high school if Facebook didn't exist. And so I think it's always going to be an ongoing conversation about how do we manage sort of the evolution of our social contract. And sort of to close out, I think one of the most important things that we need to think about is how do we deal with privacy when before we always knew the people who knew about us. Now a kid in China can find out who I'm married to, what my house looks like, et cetera. And how do we develop empathy with people that we know all these personal details about but that we've never met? And I think that's going to be one of the great challenges. And certainly that's not a regulatory issue.
Okay. Well, so Heather, I'd like to talk to you about Google. I mean, Google is, it started out with a big goal, right, of organizing the world's information, and the more information that's out there, the more complicated the challenge becomes. So, Google rather, famously ran into problems after the launch of Google Buzz in February of last year because the default setting shared more information than some people wanted to share. So the company's taken a different approach with Google+, designing it from the start with privacy in mind. And I was wondering if you can kind of explain, with some of those lessons that Google has learned from the Buzz experience that have changed how Google+ is designed and just the approach going forward with some of your social products and trying to design privacy in from the outset.
Absolutely, and you're right. We learned a lot from our mistakes in the Buzz launch, and I think the big overall message that Google as a company learned is that we have to address privacy and we have to make it a priority, and we have to think about it from perspectives other than a developer perspective and other than the Silicon Valley perspective, where people are much more apt to share and be comfortable with some of these things than perhaps my mom, sitting at home. She doesn't understand this as intuitively as we might, and we don't even understand it as intuitively as others. And so with that in mind, and having kind of done our meditation on Buzz and said, well, how can we do this right? We did develop Google+ with privacy in mind, and very, very front of mind there is a feature called Circles, which allows contextual sharing. Like Dana was saying, control of the cultural, social context is one of those pieces of privacy, and so Google+ Circles are designed to allow you to group friends, followers, other people in whatever groups you want to share with and whatever context you want to create. For example, I'm going to share different things with my college buddies than I'm going to share with my family, simply because maybe my extended family really doesn't care to read for days and days about my reunion plans, but my college buddies, will spend hours. And it's not even so much that I would be embarrassed that this information came out. It's just that social context. And we wanted to give users more control over what people saw. The other thing we did with Google+ is we took the privacy settings out of a settings page and off of the preferences page. They're not buried. Most of the privacy settings around the content that you share are actually right next to the box where you type it in or you share your photo. You can set all of those settings right as you look at the content that you're sharing. And we think that makes it a lot more clear to users exactly what they're doing rather than, a set and forget default.
Okay. So there are obviously other companies. There's one that you might have heard of called Facebook. They're not participating here on this call that we can talk about. And, I want to just, at a more broad level, I think one thing that almost everyone can agree on when you're talking about personal information, digital information, is that the genie is kind of already out of the bottle. Information's out there, and so when we're talking about privacy in the introduction, there was some version of control that came up as a theme. What about the role of companies in terms of being responsible data stewards? And Dana, in your research with young people, I know you've talked about the idea that they don't just look at controlling access to content, but they kind of negotiate it by talking about controlling access to the meaning, so that they'll share information, but do so in a way that you'd have to know them to kind of understand it. But if we talk about, instead of just trying to limit the collection of information, and focus instead on how that data is used by companies, what should companies do to be responsible data stewards? And I want to first ask that question to Terrence.
Well, I think the really interesting thing about privacy, and I've got to give Google some props for this, is I think that Google has tended to be the most transparent of the large internet properties in sort of driving the debate. Yes, there were some bobbles for buzz, but this idea of really explaining to people, this is what we're collecting, this is what we're going to do with it. I think they've been leaders in that area. In terms of what companies, large companies can do to be responsible, I think it breaks down into a couple of things. The first is be very clear what data you're collecting, because there's lots of technologies that are being used sort of quietly, e-tags, cookies, et cetera, to gather data. There's a big controversy now where people are just discovering that with Facebook, you don't necessarily have to be logged in or even a member for Facebook to collect information about your web browsing habits. And I think the transparency and visibility of things like that is critical to developing a relationship between the consumer and large internet properties. And I think that as a person that runs a company that is sort of an infrastructure company to help collect and analyze that data, one of the big concerns here is that there's going to be a lot of blowback when people understand all of the various ways that we quietly collect data about them. I think the second thing, and this is probably going to have to be a legislative effort, and it's going to be very hard to get done across geographies, is that I think that we really need to apply some ownership, sort of property rights to your data, so that when I, for example, sell it to a marketing company, if I've collected on my website, if I sell it, I should tell you I've sold it. Now, I don't necessarily need to pay you, but I should at least inform you about how this data that you've generated is being used, so you have some understanding about how you exist in the virtual world. And I think if we can do those two things, which is inform consumers up front, this is what we're going to collect, this is how we're going to collect it. And the second thing, this is anytime I use your data outside of my sort of corporate environs, this is how your data has been transferred, and this is how it's going to be aggregated with other data about you, so that you can make informed decisions about whether you want to do business with me. I think then everybody will be a lot happier, because I think the value that's added by companies like Google, by companies like Facebook, most consumers are going to choose to participate as long as they understand what their visibility is and what data is being transferred about them.
So, I mean, Dana, you've said, in a presentation that I watched, that big data is Soylent Green, right? Meaning it's made up of people. And someone yesterday, when I tweeted about an article in the New York Times yesterday, the day before, about big data, and someone retweeted it and made the comment that, big data is made up of little data. And, people produce that information in context. So Dana, what do you think needs to be done to manage privacy in the age of big data, where, computing power and the ability to do analytics is really kind of ramping up at an unprecedented pace that's going to enable, different uses, again, of information that didn't exist even a few years ago?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the most important things is that we have these conversations. In some ways, we're entering into an environment where data is related to each other in weird ways, and we don't always understand it. I mean, even amongst the four of us, we radically disagree on certain things about just basics of how we understand this. And as I've been hearing these different conversations, I can't help but, respond to some of them, which is I think that causes trouble to actually position publicness and publicity against privacy. And because a lot of what's also at stake is around intimacy. One of the main reasons that people share is in order to be intimate. And the fact that we now have those data traces means that we have to understand how to read that intimacy in context and what that means in terms of friendships that are being built and engagement. It's also why things are complicated by saying, okay, well, I want to, share this just with a few people. Because more often than not, people's experiences are, I'm happy for anybody to have this except for a few people. And that's actually really hard to design into technology, right? All of these systems that are like, please let everybody but my mother see this, right? That's hard. And so our architecture is actually not meant to do that kind of formula. So we're struggling with that. And in some ways, this is true for the data issues. Let everybody see my health issues that might be able to help me except for the insurance company, right? That's a particular model. And that's why I think there's this really interesting innovation happening as people try to control access to meaning instead of controlling access to content, because that's part of where this all gets messy. It's also why the real names debate that Google has faced is actually a privacy issue. Now, in terms of how to actually address this stuff, I think part of it is that there's, I go back to Larry Lessig on this. There are 4 modes of regulation of any given system: the market, the law, social norms, and technology or architecture, right? Or code, shall we say. And I think that we're going to see all 4 of these playing out in the privacy element in different directions. And I think that part of it is we have to pay attention to what's going on. And it's not just a market versus market and technology versus law kind of perspective. I actually think social norms are very much a part of this conversation. And I think that the technology companies that can actually best understand social norms and work with people are the ones that are going to succeed.
Agreed.
Does anyone want to add on to that or respond?
I would love to jump in. This is Jim Adler. I think that we've talked a lot about innovation and how do we innovate responsibly, and I've often said innovation is a team sport, and you need to engage, as Dana said, discussions like this, your toughest critics, because you get great ideas from them. And we just came out with a product called TrueRep, which gives you the ability to be aware of the information that's out there about you. Terrence, you mentioned people need to have some awareness of what's out there, and we see an opportunity there, clearly. We want people to be able to suppress certain safety-sensitive information. And we got that idea from the domestic violence community. We went through this long discussion about what does opt-out mean versus what does suppression of safety-sensitive information mean. And when we started that debate and discussion with that community, it was pretty contentious. And as we worked through it, we actually came to a solution that was very nuanced and really addressed the specific need and vulnerability of that community. And we thought it was such a great idea that we opened this feature up to all our customers for this product. So I think that what often looks untenable to begin with, if you have your ear to the ground and you're listening to especially not the people that agree with you, but the people that don't agree with you, you often can find something where the whole is greater than the parts.
Okay, great. Well, Jim, after the last Privacy Identity Innovation Conference, you and I were talking, and you made a comment that I thought was pretty comical. You talked about Congress unleashing a legislative kraken to try and protect consumers. So if you're a Pirates of the Caribbean fan like I am, you'll get the reference of the kraken. And I think there's always a question of, can any regulation keep pace with technology? And what's the role of the government? And I guess specifically I'm talking about the U.S. government right now, but there's obviously stuff happening in Europe as well and around the world. But what is the role of government when it comes to digital privacy? And I'd like to start by asking that question of Heather, since you're actually in the D.C. office there at Google. What do you think?
I am in the D.C. office, and it's actually been really interesting to watch over the last few years as privacy became kind of front of mind for legislators who maybe don't use these same technological tools, and thus it wasn't nearly as pressing. But I think there are some really good examples of how legislating technology around concepts like privacy can be a really hard thing to do. For example, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act is a law that was passed in 1986, and it's the law that governs how technology providers and service providers like Google have to respond to government access requests. And honestly, for a law that's 35 years old, it's doing pretty well given the amount that technology has changed. But it really doesn't match the technological landscape. There's other laws like the Privacy Act, which really was intended to address file cabinets, not computers or databases, let alone all of the data mining and relational inferences. And with that in mind, I think that legislators have to be a little bit cautious about how they address these things and make sure that they're talking to people who really understand at a deep level how this stuff works, and that they're not that they're really addressing the problems at hand rather than trying to make broad strokes.
Okay. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this idea of what the government's role should be?
Yeah, this is Dana. I think part of it, I think Heather's right. There's a lot of unintended consequences of well-intended laws. And I think we see that tremendously in the privacy domain precisely because we don't have clarity on what it is that we're trying to protect and because the technology is moving really rapidly. You know, from my perspective, I've been spending lots of time thinking about the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is a tremendously well-intended piece of legislation that is meant to empower parents. But one of the things that we see is that parents don't want to have, you know, their kids restricted from getting access to certain sites, and you know, at the same time, the technology companies feel as though they don't have, you know, their hands are tied so that they're limiting access as the solution. And we see this sort of mess as it plays out. And I think this is really unfortunate because I think we keep seeing this with different kinds of privacy laws. They're really well intended, but they're not set up in the right structure. I also think that most of the legal structures are about data collection, and I think a lot of what we need to do is shift the conversation from, you know, how is this data collected to, you know, how is it being used? And I think that a lot of our models actually really have to think through usage, not just collection.
Jim, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to get in here. This is Jim Adler. Dana, I think you're completely right on. I actually have this confusion matrix chart that I put in some of my talks around how confused policy is around this, where we're trying to legislate data uses, which is really a scalpel kind of surgical regulation that's required, and we come at it with a chainsaw around data access. And I think that if you look at the panoply of legislation that's out there, I think the most inspired, especially in between corporations and citizens, I think ECPA, the Electronic Communication Privacy Act that Heather mentioned, is really between government, which is, I think, requires very different privacy regime than between citizens and corporations. But the Fair Credit Reporting Act of 1970 was, I think, very inspired, very practical for its time, but very far-reaching and visionary, because it really said, I don't care how you get the data, but if you're going to use it for employment or housing or other business purpose, you really have to honor a certain process of prior consent to the check, to the background check, and then providing notification of adverse information so that someone doesn't get dinged or punished for mistaken identity or incorrect information. And that is really a usage kind of policy that I think we can really learn from.
This is Terrence. I think a couple of points on my side. I think the first thing is we really need to understand that data is international. So it's going to be difficult for any domestic legislative body to really have a sort of the global impact that's needed. I mean, what are the laws that pertain to your data if the servers are in Bulgaria? I mean, there's been this big discussion about what the Patriot Act means in the EU, and Microsoft's public position is that the Patriot Act is the law of their country, so EU regulations will not supersede it. And so I think that the legislative bodies have a real problem. One, they can't keep up with technology. The inflection points are just too great, particularly in this area. And two, there's no global regulatory infrastructure that can be really applied here. And so it's great that we're working on sort of the data usage problems here in the States, but consumers need to understand that once we're outside of the borders, then the rules of the road in the U.S. may not apply, and we just have to deal with that.
Right. So what, along the same lines, just having this conversation about the regulatory issue, what do you think, Heather, I'll ask you first, what do you think about this notion of the right to be forgotten or the right to delete our data, which is, idea that's been proposed by regulators in Europe? What's your take on whether or not that's a good idea? But I think the feasibility of how that would work is also another topic, but it's certainly a discussion that's being had.
I think that the right to be forgotten is a really catchy phrase, but unfortunately, it's not nearly as simple as just privacy. in fact, it pulls in free expression and censorship and all sorts of kind of related issues that really complicate any right to be forgotten in a way that doesn't really work in this networked world. I think Dana mentioned, who owns an email. When there's a shared ownership in a social situation, who has the right to be forgotten? And does my right to be forgotten trump your right to speak? And how do we come to some sort of solution around those? With that said, I think that users should absolutely have a right to be forgotten in terms of those things that they post and their content. But when they're sharing the context and maybe when it's a picture that someone else posts of me, I don't really think that I can claim ownership of that. I could ask, hopefully, my friend to take it down, but I don't think that that's an absolute right in a shared context.
Dana, do you want to share?
No, actually, generally, Heather and I agree on this one. I love it conceptually, and it makes so much sense conceptually, right, the right to be forgotten. But pragmatically, it doesn't play out reasonably, and it doesn't play out at a global level. And I think that the point about it, being global, I think is extremely important. So I think for me, the concern there is actually to shift from the right to be forgotten and more towards a framework for thinking about the right to be recognized as being separately, a separate context. So, do we want to see some data to be able to be removed? Yes. I should be able to correct and remove data from certain kinds of databases. For example, health records, right? That becomes a very clear one because of its usage implications, not necessarily because of its existence. It's also why, we have certain models in the U.S. that make sense along these lines, which is that if I walk into your office, looking for a job, you can make some very good guesses about my race, about my age, about my gender, about a whole set of things that are written on the body. And yet, you're actually held responsible to say that you can't discriminate against me based on these things. Of course people discriminate against you on these things, but part of it is having this strict conversation of recognizing that this is a way of understanding data that you have access to without having intended to. And in some ways I think that we have different kinds of data sets around the right to be forgotten, and we need to treat them differently, but I think that the broad notion of forgetting is just, it's untenable.
Jim, what's your take? I mean, your company uses public records data to offer products like people searches and background checks, and it would obviously impact you if all of a sudden people were able to just start deleting chunks of data. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the right to be forgotten is in direct conflict to the right to history, and where do you draw that line? And I think there has to be some information that's going to be public that we base our relationships on. There's going to be, I think, the way you get out of this conundrum in some sense, and we've been talking about it and around this, is defining what areas are clearly private and what areas are sensitive and need special attention and which places are not. This sort of blanket idea that all data is just going to drop off the face of the earth in 6 months is untenable. We would just sort of recoil into our hovels and drop off the grid, and I think a lot of lessons would not be learned, and a lot of relationships would not grow, and I think we'd be damaged for it in the long run. So certainly my conflicts are on my sleeve, but I completely believe that we cannot walk away from the public interaction with other people.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to ask Terrence. I want to ask you one question before we go to the audience questions. You and I have talked about the book that you and Mary wrote. One of the concerns that you have is how governments will use the information that they're able to collect about citizens. We talk a lot about what companies are doing with the information, and my take in our conversations is that one of the things that worries you the most is really what is the government going to do. And so, do you think that transparency can, is the answer, that it can shine enough light on what the government's doing to protect citizens? We've talked about regulation, but what about the notion of just making everything more transparent so that we know what the government knows about us and what they're doing with the information they have about us?
So you're right. It's one of my big concerns. I'm always afraid of being sort of classed into the sort of the black helicopter crowd. but it's clear that the government has a legitimate need to collect information for law enforcement, for anti-terrorism activities, et cetera. My big concern is that we've moved to a model where governments can make these requests in secret. Google's got a great website up about the number of government requests that they've gotten for information about their users, et cetera. And Heather probably knows the percentage, but it's gone up a huge amount. Sprint got thousands of requests for location data for U.S. citizens. And a lot of this stuff has moved extrajudicial. So it used to be you had to get a warrant to find out a lot of this information. But with the Patriot Act, basically the FBI has to say, oh, it's a terrorism investigation, and we are going to issue a national security letter, and you will give us this information secretly. And that's problematic because we have a democracy. We need to be able to understand what sort of data the government is collecting. We need to understand the purposes that the government plans to put it to. We don't necessarily need to know operational details. And clearly, if there is a major terrorist investigation, then the government should be able to go to a judge and say, we need to collect information secretly on these people. What the government shouldn't be able to do is to tap into the internet backbone, as happened under the Bush administration, and basically troll the internet for problems. And I think that one of the things that I think everybody needs to think about is that even if you trust your current government, no matter which country you're in, governments change and sometimes bad guys come to power. And do we really want, the power of big data technology and the aggregation of data that can determine people's ethnicity, their genetic history, et cetera? Do we really want that data to be collected in hidden ways so that some maniac, when they come to power, has access to that data? And I don't know what the answer is, but it certainly seems to be something that's worth thinking about.
Okay. Does anyone want just a quick response before we go to the Q&A? Does anyone want to add anything? No? Okay. Let's go to the questions. So we've got a lot of questions, and some of them, of course, came in earlier, and so I think we've addressed a few of these, but want to start. There's one that's related to what we were just talking about. So government's required to share nearly all information by public request via public record request laws. How can we expect their involvement to withhold any of that information? I'm just reading the question, but I don't know, Jim, if you want to respond. I mean, I guess it's again related to what we were just talking about, but there does seem to be a bit of a conflict there if there's, the government is required to make certain things public. I mean, how can people have privacy?
Well, I think there's certain information, again, that's public and certain information that's private. I don't think your IRS, your tax return can be requested by a FOIA request. And so there's certain information that the government really should not share because it is clearly private. Your property records traditionally are public because the public has some interest in making sure that taxes are levied equitably. So I think the government, you can't just say in a blanket statement that the government should give everything away or shouldn't give anything away. This is, I know it's messy, but we talked about it a lot. It's about context and the data itself and ultimately the uses of that data.
All right. Okay. Anyone else?
I think just to build on that, this is Dana, just to build on that, I think that this is one of the challenges with these ideas of radical transparency, which is often juxtaposed against complete privacy, where context is really key to a lot of this, and a lot of it has to do with interpretation. So, when I think about some of the government data that I'm sort of invested in dealing with, I think about what it means to see registered sex offenders, right? And here's this data set that we think of as like, good to have out there because we imagine the registered sex offender as this horrible perpetrator who's come and attacks our kids, and we have these crazy intense images of them. But as somebody I started diving into actually who's on the registered sex offender lists, and it's actually some of it's really sad. It's 18-year-olds who were arrested for their relationship with their 16-year-old. It's messy things like this. So I think part of it is also even in things that we have as good versus bad, in terms of publicness, we have to really account for how to deal with what happens when things are available. How do we make certain that the interpretations are done in a way that actually respects what the data is about and not done in a way to further hurt people who in some ways are themselves very much victimized by the system?
Can I build on that further?
Yes, so Jim.
Real quick. This is Jim Adler. Yeah. So I think that there needs to be, in which the signals are not really out there yet for really fine-grained both accountability and empathy around a lot of this data. We deal with the sex offender database as well, and it is. You're right, Dan. It's very sad. And we sort of, with this broad brush, we sort of throw everybody into this one hopper of a scarlet letter sort of judgment. And there's no nuance. And we need to figure out nuance. We need to figure out signals for accountability that you do get, and empathy that you do get when you're face-to-face with someone or in a small community. And I think the accountability and the empathy signals are sort of lagging the disclosure signals and ultimately data and inference that are way ahead.
Okay, I want to, so this is an audience question. I'd like to pose this initially to Heather. So how do we educate people about privacy when people still gladly fork over all of their private data for an extra level of Angry Birds or something similar, which is definitely, research shows that people say that they value privacy, but their behavior is different. And I know that's a complicated issue that is, as Dana kind of, mentioned. But, Heather, what is, Google, I know, recently launched a new campaign called Good to Know. You've tried various ways to kind of help people control and understand what's being used with their information, but what's your response to this question?
Yeah, no, educating users and consumers is hard because they only have so much bandwidth, so much attention that they can pay to these issues, and either they do their research and figure out what's going on, or maybe they muddle around a little bit. We've tried to make it really clear, and like you said, we just launched an educational campaign called Good to Know that does, it talks through like why are some passwords better than others. Why should you maybe log out if you're on a public computer? What is a cookie? That kind of stuff. But even there, when we're doing that kind of education, we lack those signals. When people, those privacy surveys don't tend to have those really nuanced signals either, and kind of ask, well, if you want to play Angry Birds, are you really forking over all your personal information, or are they checking a few things so that they can pay for their servers and create a business model based on flinging Angry Birds at mean pigs, which I have to say I enjoy greatly, and I'm glad that they've figured out a way to do that. And so it is so confusing and so hard to communicate that it does take a lot of doing to get that education out there for consumers. And part of that, I think, is going to be figuring out what point in the process a user really needs to see something. What point in the process are they going to look at privacy controls and say, oh, I have a choice about this? At what point in the experience do they understand the service well enough to say, oh, so I'm sharing this and this, but I don't want to share, my hometown.
Right. So Dana, you're an ethnographer, and you spend a lot of time, particularly with young people, kind of watching how they're using technology. What is your take on how to educate people when there's technology, like I said, just changes so quickly? There's new products, there's new services, there's new ways of sharing, and with that, consequences.
Sure. I think a lot of it is going to be experiential. In some ways, their parents aren't actually equipped to tell them how to use the technologies. They don't necessarily know what the features are about. They don't know what's changing. In some ways, they're experimenting and trying to figure this out amongst themselves. What their parents and what other adults can offer is perspective on how to think through these issues, right? So it's not about necessarily teaching them how to use the technologies, but it's saying, like, okay, you made that available. Here's one way in which I would interpret that. Are you really okay with me interpreting what you wrote that way? And the answer is often like, no, you're not supposed to think of it that way. So it's about those conversational modes. And it's about, again, with young people, starting a large conversation, not telling them how to think about privacy, but allowing them to engage and deal with and think about privacy in a networked age. And that's where, my general take on a lot of educational issues is that a lot of it is about working these things out collectively across age rather than coming up with a set of facts and details that will be outdated by the time they're printed.
Okay.
Young people are people. Right?
Yep.
Terrence, did you want to, I think we lost you for a second, but you're back on the line. Did you want to respond to the question of, how can we better educate people, all of us, about how to manage our personal information?
Well, yes, I'd love to. What I think is that people really need to go back to sort of some of the basics. In general, when we talk to anybody that's not a close family member, we make sort of the basic assumption that what we shared might be shared with other people. And I think if you're older than 30, for some reason that being on a website changes that basic model, and there's an assumption that what I say in email, what I put up on Facebook is private. The good news is that when you talk to people that are under 20, they're very aware that they live in a much more public world, that they live in, and I think I stole this line from Jim, that they live in this public square. And I think education is nice, but I think honestly, it's a generational issue, and I can't imagine that any 16-year-old is unaware that what he writes today is likely going to follow him for the rest of his life. And I think what we really need to do is concentrate on educating people that are older, like ourselves, that you really are living in a public square, that if you wouldn't say it to your next-door neighbor, then you shouldn't share it on the internet. And I think that once we do that, a lot of the strum and drang around privacy issues will go away.
So another question that came in from the audience on this topic is whose responsibility is it to educate the public? Corporations, government? Are we just are all of us responsible for educating ourselves?
Natalie, can I jump in here? This is Dana. I actually think it's dangerous to put young people in a separate category and say adults have figured out that this will affect them for the rest of their lives and kids haven't, because frankly the adults that I speak to have no clue. I think that a lot of what ends up happening as we think through this is that people are making calculations in their head that are very informal, that are very fast-paced, and they're saying, am I more likely to gain something from putting this out there or lose something? And gain something is often, am I likely to get this person who I think is hot to come out on a date with me? That would be a success even if it ends up causing me problems professionally down the line. I also think it's important to realize that privilege is a huge factor here, which is that the more privileged somebody is, the more they tend to be very nervous about the costs, and they think about the costs a lot more than they think about the gains. This is actually true for young people as well. So when I deal with young people who are trying to think about going to Harvard, they're much more concerned about what they have to share. When I think about kids who are not even going to go to college, they're thinking about what they have to gain from what they put out there. And there's this really difficult challenge, which is why this is a complex networked issue. I also think, it's not, to your question, Natalie, it's not just about, is it companies, is it government, is it teachers, who's going to educate? I think that this is where we have to actually have public dialogue. And so the answer really is everyone. Everyone needs to be in this conversation. Everyone needs to be engaged with thinking through these issues. But I think we also have to respect that there are reasons why people share that may be totally conflicting to our own. And I'll give an extreme example just because I think it sends a really strong signal, which is that I was interviewing a young woman and she was a teenager. She was under the age of 18, and she opened up her MySpace while she was talking to me, and my jaw fell on the floor because what she showed me was her MySpace profile that was filled with naked images and total pornographic material, which, of course, legally is child pornography. And I was aghast, and I didn't know what to do, and I stumbled out a very uncomfortable question. I was like, don't you think you're going to get into trouble for this? And she looks at me and goes, no, it's hot. And I'm like, well, maybe you wouldn't get into college. And she looks at me and she goes, I'm not getting into college anyhow. And she made it very clear to me she had a better chance of becoming a model by putting up these images than she had of ever getting into college. And that kind of extreme version of it is a lot of why this calculation is very different for very different people.
Can I just jump in? I have a couple teenage boys, and I think that's, I always say that, especially with privacy, the present value of a future disaster is zero, and that's if you have something to gain. If you feel like if your future value actually will be more than zero, and if you have nothing to lose right now, there's even more incentive to not really think through what you're doing. And I think young people are sort of in that boat, and I think no matter what age you are, you have to do that calculation, and young people, to your point, Dana, do that calculation. They have nothing to lose. They're going to push forward. And I think it's a conversation and education to get people to sort of understand. And what we're talking about here is that these privacy issues really reflect societal issues, and that's why things get so muddy.
This is Terrence. I actually had a quick question for Dana. Do you believe that the kids that you've talked to are unaware that this data will follow them the rest of their lives, or they just made that calculation that it's worth it?
This is Dana. I think that they are thinking very much about with the perspective that they currently have, so the opportunities that they see. And I would say that this is true for people of all ages. It's just that older folks at least hopefully have greater perspective, and they've dealt with different kinds of consequences. I don't think that anybody is actually that good at thinking into the future. I think generally speaking, people are dreadful at it. And I think that's actually what makes this all very difficult. There are always the exceptions. There are the people who wanted to be president since they were 5 and have been wearing, bow ties since about the age of 7, on a determination to, look presidential. But the majority of people are very much thinking about the near future. So when you're dealing with high school kids, they're thinking about college. They're very much thinking about college. But they're not thinking, for example, about what happens when they're married with children. That's so far in the future. And likewise, even people who are in their 30s or 40s, they may be thinking about their professional career in which they have experience with it, but they're not even necessarily imagining the world with their grandchildren who are going to come back to them and say, hey, I saw this thing. Right? So there's all of these just different issues where people's perspective is always narrowed, and it's also narrowed geographically and locally. So people don't necessarily think about how what they say might be problematic or interpreted horribly in a foreign country, which they may one day have to work with people from that country. So there's all of these just messiness, but people are thinking about it, but it's not necessarily that they have the perspective to do so wisely.
Okay, great. So we have just about 5 minutes left, and I know that we do have a hard stop. And so just wanted to ask each of you, give each of you a chance, and I'll just call on you one by one, but the question that we started off with, can there be privacy in a digital age? I mean, one of the popular phrases that you hear whenever this issue of privacy comes up is privacy's dead or privacy isn't dead. I mean, that's the terms in which it's discussed, one or the other. What are your final thoughts on kind of where we go from here? And I'm going to start by asking you, Heather. And also, where can people get more information?
I think for in terms of more information, Google's put together some pretty awesome sites. Google.com/good-to-know is the one that was mentioned earlier, and then our privacy center is at google.com/privacy, and it goes into a lot of detail. But in terms of your first question, and just in kind of a summary, I think we've established in the course of an hour that this is really hard, that user education is really hard, that privacy depends on context, and everyone sees it a little bit differently just because their perspective is different and their expectations may be different and the consequences to them may be different. And I take from that we need to give users choices, and we need to make it clear, what those choices mean, and what the data is and what the impact is. And like Jim said, make sure that those societal consequences that we don't think should happen as a result of this data. You don't get hired, or you get fired, or your insurance company drops you. And those are the things that we really need to look at and say, okay, we can all agree on this. Let's start there.
Okay, great. And you're on Twitter at Heather West, right? And
I am.
Jim, what about you? What are your final thoughts? And if you have your blog or other places you want to point people to so they can get more information?
Sure. Just to summarize, I think technology is mapping our values to this new medium, and I think these discussions are as well. I think ultimately governments may get involved, and I'm always one to. I think it's a good thing that legislation lags technology to a certain extent, because I think if it gets ahead, a lot more baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And so I think it's important that we have these very even contentious discussions about this. So I think ultimately we're going to innovate our way out of this. We typically have in the past, but I think we can't. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It's not going to be a one-product-fits-all. It's going to be a process of refinement, and that's the human experience. And the reason privacy is so messy because human beings are so messy, and that's that's just the boat we're in, which is why this field is so interesting. If you want to understand more, we just announced TrueRep.com, and that's I think a great place where you can see what's publicly known about you. Not just what you put out there, but what is available. You can check out your background check, at least a thumbnail of it. There's some privacy controls for free. You can read more about privacy and my musings on it at jimadler.me, and I'm on Twitter at @JimUnderAdler.
Okay. Dana?
Sure.
What resources would you share, and kind of what are your closing thoughts on the discussion?
Sure. For the closing thoughts, I think one of the things that I love about technology is it complicates anything that we think we understand. And I think that these issues of privacy are so nuanced, so messy, that I think we've got a long road to figure them out at a technological level and at a social level. And I'm excited that people are actually engaged in these conversations, even if it gets contentious, even if it gets gnarly. And I think that that's part of what makes it exciting, because I think we are forced in a network society to see things in new light. And so I'm excited by that. In terms of reaching me, you can reach me at Danah.org, and I tweet out at Zephoria, Zephoria.
Okay, great. Terrence?
So the couple of things that I would emphasize is, one, let's accentuate the positive. As Jim and others on the panel have mentioned, we're getting a huge amount of benefit from the social network we're doing, and so let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. What I think we should focus on now is to make sure that it's transparent how our data is being aggregated and being used, so we can avoid all of the bad things. And also to focus on using the amount of information that's available to make governments more responsive and more accountable. I think there's a huge amount of benefit that we as world citizens can have by really paying attention to all the information that sort of leaks out there. Because of the lack of privacy. We have more information about what our government does in our name than ever before. We have more information about the people that we do business with. And by and large, I think that's positive. In terms of how we manage our personal privacy, I think we just need to apply the rule that what goes on the Internet stays on the Internet. And if you really don't want people to know something, you should just be very careful and not place it out on digital media. But like I said, let's focus on the positive. In terms of sort of resources, I'm a big fan of EFF.org. Our blog.patternbuilders.com, talks a lot about privacy issues as well as big data technology. And I think we're moving into one of the most sort of interesting ages of human endeavor, and let's all get excited about it.
Great. Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you again. Thank O'Reilly Media. Thank all of you for participating. This is the first webcast that I've moderated, and you've made it all a very pleasant experience, so I appreciate it. I'm on Twitter at TechPolicy, and I know that there are some questions that we weren't able to get to. If you who submitted those questions want to put them on Twitter using the StrataConf hashtag, hopefully Heather, Jim, Terrence, and Dana, if you have some time today to check out that, maybe we can continue the conversation there. But thank you again, everyone, and hopefully we'll have more conversations like this soon. You can check out PII2011.com as well to learn more about the events that we have coming up. Okay, thank you very much.